Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name's Michelle Waitley, and I'm the Specialised Business Bank Executive for Commercial Real Estate here at NAB. As we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from in Melbourne. And I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that it's National Reconciliation Week this week, with the very important theme of now more than ever. So welcome to our May quarterly webinar for our property market series. We know that commercial real estate has a significant environmental impact. So today our topic is net zero carbon buildings, the value impacts and the emerging risks and regulatory landscape that need to be considered. With a heightened global focus on reducing carbon emissions and building resilience to climate change, we're having a lot of conversations with our customers about the impact of government policies, regulatory frameworks, CapEx requirements to upgrade buildings, and emerging tenant requirements, particularly with reporting standards commencing in January 2025. NAB is committed to sustainable practices in our business, and we're here to support your sustainability plans. Joining me today as our guest speakers are Caitlin Uren and Stephen Brummer from JLL. Caitlin is the head of ESG for JLL Capital Markets Australia and is very passionate about decarbonising the built environment. She leads sustainable investment strategy to mitigate risk and unlock value in the transition to net zero. Caitlin is a capital market specialist with 14 years experience across the UK and Australia, previously working for JLL UK across their transaction and valuation businesses. Stephen is a passionate leader in net zero carbon buildings consultancy, dedicated to creating sustainable solutions for clients, including government and listed corporations. With a Bachelor of Engineering from the University of Queensland, he's a registered professional engineer and also an accredited Green Star and NAB assessor. Stephen combines 25 years of expertise in mechanical services and asset repositioning with a genuine commitment to energy efficiency and sustainability, positively impacting every project he undertakes. Thanks so much for joining us, Caitlin and Stephen. As Australia's largest business bank, I want to assure you that we're committed to helping businesses transition towards a more sustainable future. We are open for business and we're here to support you with your opportunities and, of course, to work through any challenges you may be facing. I'm really proud that we launched a green loan for commercial real estate in February this year. Our loan can support you to acquire, to build, or to retrofit eligible assets to create lower emission buildings. And we've already funded several buildings under the green loan. Please speak to your banker if you're interested in exploring this type of funding, and they can work through the criteria with you. The property sector remains critically important to the Australian economy, and with our deep understanding of the market, we look forward to continuing to work with you as your finance partners during 2024. We will have time for questions after the formal presentations. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and we'll get to as many as possible. And we're also recording this session and we'll share it and the slides with you afterwards. On that note, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Caitlin.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here today. A fantastic introduction. You know, the built environment is one sector of the economy where we already have the technology. We've got proven investment case studies to actually deliver net zero. So, you know, it's a great opportunity for everyone on this call to take advantage from that and to really see that capital value uplift across portfolio. So look, I'm just going to share my slides and we'll get started with the presentation today. I will be focusing at the beginning of the presentation on the regulatory framework and all the ways in which this is really impacting the demand and as such the value of zero carbon buildings, and you know, really reflecting that this is going to be increasing over the next little while. So to kick things off, probably the most important regulation that is on the way through in Australia is the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. So the federal government put through their final policy position in January. This was actually debated last week, and what they have proposed is that there will be an annual reporting requirement, which is attached to when you're doing your financial reporting. Similarly, you will be required to create a clear report framework which captures your emissions data. So what greenhouse gas is your company responsible for? There is a phased process in terms of who is required to report on this and when they are required to report, which we capture on the slide here. So the larger entities are the first, and as well as what's called the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporters, which are our big carbon emitters, the likes of mining corporations. Now, originally they were proposing for this reporting to start midway through this year, but that's been pushed to 1 Jan 2025. We're waiting for that final date to come through, which is expected in the coming months. But essentially, it will first trigger large corporations. You have to hit 2 of the 3 requirements that you see on the page here. Now, when we bring this back specifically to asset owners, which comes down to category 3, we're seeing that asset owners with 5 billion or more under management are going to be triggered as of the 2nd year of reporting, so 2026. And you might be thinking, you know what, this is just the big corporations, it doesn't really impact me. But actually, when you look at what's required to report, firstly, it's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And I'll do a quick definition of that shortly, but that is essentially the greenhouse gas emissions that, you know, a company is responsible for, that they actually create. But then as of year 2 of reporting, so for JLL as an example, we are going to be captured in group 1. So we'll be reporting on our emissions data as of next year. But as of the following year, just 2026, we have to report on all of our scope 3 emissions. And that is essentially the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the businesses that we work with. So either the businesses that we pay or the people that pay us to do certain services. So what that means is, even if you're not a major corporation, you are likely going to be working for or with one that is. And so what this reporting does is really capture the sort of wider commercial market. This isn't just property specific, this is all business. And it will really start to see, you know, a really sharp focus on what we are doing in terms of our reduction on climate change. And specifically, it's going to create absolute transparency. So there is no deciding whether you do or don't report, or whether you do or don't care and act on, you know, a reduction or decarbonisation of your business. It's going to be out there for everyone to see. Now, the other part of their reporting requirements is around climate resilience. And that is, from a real estate perspective, when we look at, you know, the properties that we own, and, you know, are they subject to flooding or increased fire risk, you know, whatever that may look like. And so given that you're going to have to be reporting on this, it's obviously open public reporting, so anyone is able to sort of see that. There will start to be, you know, a greater awareness around climate risk, which, you know, is going to be escalating as we see the impacts of global warming. So if your asset is in a location that's already been seeing, you know, increased levels of flooding, as an example, then having to report on that, you know, may become a risk point within your portfolio. So we're, you know, really this great opportunity as a result of this required reporting to really get on the front foot of how you deal with that risk. So just to sort of break down those scopes, just for those that perhaps aren't fully across this, when we talk about scope 1 emissions, that is any greenhouse gases created in your physical assets. So for real estate, this is, you know, your gas within the building. So if your building is, you know, let's say you've got an office building that has gas boilers creating heat, then that is your scope 1, because it's actually created on site, directly in your physically owned or operated assets. Your scope 2, and this is across, you know, any way in which you're operating, not just in real estate. Scope 2 is essentially just the energy that you pay for to power buildings. So if you're purchasing electricity, gas as an example, all of these things that create energy are your scope 2. So when you're paying your utilities provider, that is your scope 2 emissions. So from a real estate perspective, again, bringing this back to how you can optimize value, if you are able to take to market a product that is all electric, so removing all of your on-site fossil fuels, and that is powered by renewable energy, you've got an opportunity to provide to the market and to a tenant profile a piece of real estate that is free from any emissions and which removes the requirement for them to report on. So this is becoming increasingly attractive from a marketing perspective. And that's certainly what we're hearing from our tenant rep teams, our leasing teams, just continued awareness around whether a building is all electric. And obviously it's in their wheelhouse to be able to acquire green energy, but from a base build perspective, what is being done. The final point, as we touched on earlier, is that scope 3, but it's still, as I said, only ever the scope 1 and 2 of the businesses that you're working with. So that upstream and downstream activity. So hopefully that's nice and clear. Now, in a situation where you're sort of confused around who is responsible, we look at the operational control principles. So if we break that down to real estate, as a tenant, you're not going to be in control of necessarily, the base build areas of an asset which the landlord is making decisions for and paying for. So that will be outside of your reporting wheelhouse. So we do often get a few questions around how that split between tenant and landlord works, and that all comes down to the operational control principle. Now, there is a lot of discussion right now around operational carbon, and that is, covering our energy efficiency. Operational carbon is essentially how we operate the building, so we keep them running. But there is becoming an increasing focus on embodied carbon, particularly from a real estate perspective. And we're seeing really interesting projects come out of the ground, which are really focused on reducing the carbon created through construction. Now, that's just not big developments, that's as simple as fit out. So as an example, we're seeing retailers now looking at producing, reusable fit outs that they can deploy at many of their retail locations. From a commercial perspective, we saw, certain developers look at using highly recycled, upcycled fit out from older leases that had expired, those tenants had vacated. Instead of just sending all of that, defit to landfill, they've created this really good story by, using that again and avoiding that being discarded to landfill. Embodied carbon, really important. There's also a lot of low carbon materials coming out. So low carbon concrete is sort of the most progressed. There is the least, difference from a cost perspective. But the next big materials are going to be around green steel, aluminium glazing, all of these very carbon intensive products, which to date, that we don't have the commercial, costs to make those adoptable across, the industry at a large, but there's certainly technologies that are advancing every day. Now, still focusing on the regulatory piece, the Australian government have obviously made their commitment to be net zero by 2050. When we talk about net zero, we're talking around reducing the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, same, to a point that they are only sort of 5 to 10% of your baseline level with offsetting. So basically using carbon credits to offset anything that remains. And the ways in which, not just the federal government, but state governments, city governments, local councils are really starting to prioritise this is through, from a real estate perspective, planning policy. So we've seen the City of Melbourne have their C376 policy, which essentially means that all new commercial stock must be 5-star Green Star building. Even though that's still waiting for approval, it's pretty difficult to get, substantial commercial building through the City of Melbourne without that. And then City of Sydney last year put through their net zero policy, which essentially created minimum NABERS ratings across office, shopping centre and hotels, and also required that all new or developments that were impacting 50% of the NLA, so refurbs, extensions, anything of that sort, also had to use renewable energy by 2026. And in doing so, obviously removing all scope 2 emissions. But last year in October, the New South Wales government really lifted the bar. So across the state of New South Wales, when you are putting in a development application for any non-residential building and also not industrial, then if its value is going to be more than $5 million for a new build, or it's going to be more than $10 million for a refurb redevelopment, then you are required to hit an entirely new list of criteria. So firstly, you have to submit a sustainability report on how your design is going to be prioritizing energy efficiency, waste minimization, recycling of materials where available. But more interestingly, you actually have to complete an embodied carbon report. So you need to go and get an external engineer or a QS to basically calculate the embodied emissions created or that will be created through construction. And that's got to be submitted to the local authority when you do that DA process. And whatever that calculation turns out to be will be a deciding factor for the state of New South Wales, because they are looking to reduce their carbon emissions, and embodied carbon is a really key way that they can do that. Now, separately, if you are a large commercial, what it's defined as, so you've got 1,000 square metres or more of office, NLA that is, or hotels, motels and serviced apartments of greater than 100 rooms, then you are also required to do what's called a net zero statement. So this should essentially say that this development will be all electric. Now, if it is not all electric, you need to have designed and create proof that that building has the plant area, the infrastructure to be retrofitted to be all electric. So installation of electric heat pumps by 2035 at the latest. But if you do that, they're going to make you pay for a minimum 10-year hold of carbon credits. So essentially, it's trying to, create this cost barrier that you're just going to invest in, building all electric buildings moving forward. In addition to that, you're also required to hit minimum NABERS ratings for both energy and water, at 5.5 stars as an example for office. And if you don't achieve that 2 years post-occupation, then you are required again to pay for the performance gap, is what they're calling it. So you'll have to offset any lack of performance with essentially like a renewable energy offset. So some really, quite penalty-driven approaches being adopted by New South Wales to really eradicate a situation where any new stock being created is not aligned for a net zero future. So really important to be, capturing that within, if you're acquiring land for development, if you are buying something for value add and it's going to trigger this requirement, ensuring that you're really, accounting for that in terms of your future costs. But also on the flip side, by delivering these really sustainable assets, you are going to be, likely superior than other stock on the market. And so what does that mean from an income perspective? Are you looking at, keener rents? Are you looking at a wider, tenant pool than you may have seen previously? So, there are some cost barriers, but there are also going to be some really great upsides to that from an income and a value perspective. Now, something to definitely be aware of is the changes to NABERS ratings. So NABERS have been obviously operating for a very long time. They report on the energy efficiency of a building. But to date, there has been no priority around decarbonisation of buildings. So when we talk about decarbonise, we're essentially saying removing fossil fuels and moving towards all electric. So as of 2025, they will start to sort of create this penalty for buildings which are highly reliant on gas. So you do have to be pretty highly reliant. You need to be sort of around that 75% or higher gas use, which we would really only see for a building that relies on cogen, trigen systems. Then you will, potentially lose 0.5 star next year without any other changes, just because there's changing the way in which that rating occurs based on the emissions factor. But that will increase again in 2030, which is the next time they will make that calculation change. And also in 2030, we will see an upside for buildings that are all electric. So we're really starting to see NABERS change the way in which they are, certifying buildings to reflect the way in which, sustainable buildings look now that everyone is moving towards a net zero future. What's also really important to note here is that they launched their renewable energy indicator last year. So now when you get a NAB's energy rating, you will see that there is online on their website, also when you get your certification back, a renewable energy indicator, which breaks down the level of not just energy that is based on renewables, but really importantly, if you look at the data behind it, it breaks down actually the amount of that building that is reliant on fossil fuels, so particularly gas and diesel. So there is this transparency and availability of information now that we hadn't seen previously around the performance of buildings. So it's really important to focus on that. And all of these changes, reporting requirements, DA approvals, certifications, yes, some changes need to be made, but there is going to be some really strong upside attached to that. And I've just captured here, we're seeing that obviously that it's offices and retails, which have the highest level of NABERS ratings, particularly office. And you can really see here, these are the 5 and 6 star buildings along the far side. Some of them have, 80, 90% of gas use. So these are the ones at risk. If you're sitting below this level, don't worry about next year, but certainly start to plan your CapEx around improvement before 2030. Now to talk about, the value of doing all of these works. This is some great JLL research completed by Annabelle McFarlane last year from the Early Movers Advantage report. I'll make sure to circulate a link after. This essentially analysed commercial buildings within Melbourne and Sydney and was able to look at, the general outperformance of buildings which had higher NABERS ratings. So, there was that overall 10% higher net face rents, 39 basis points lower on the yield and lower vacancy. But what's really interesting is when you look at, let's say, those, older buildings pre-1980s, those that had been upgraded to see, a 5.5 star NABERS rating or more, 27% outperformance in terms of rental levels. It also gets really interesting, when you look at buildings from a vacancy perspective. And if you bring your attention to the vacancy table in new buildings, so since 2020, which were rated between a 1 and 4 star, 40% vacancy. So we're really seeing that new stock, which isn't built, to the level of sustainability moving forward, there is such a big impact that's coming through. So some really great stats in this report just to have a look at, some great stories on the yield as well. But we're really starting, without question, to see value in highly energy efficient buildings, which aren't just energy, focused on energy performance, but it's also important to see that social value through amenity and, why, you want people to come to real estate, it's to have that experience. I mean, that's quite office and retail focused, but I think we will increasingly see that across all sectors of market, just as a result of, the competitiveness and particularly those larger institutional clients, wanting to drive change. So we continuously, every month that the research team update these stats, those variances continue to grow. And as a result of all the reporting requirements that's coming through, we expect this to continue to escalate. And what's really, interesting as well is, a lot of people like to focus on what's the green premium and where's the upside. And that, is obviously, a great attractive point that, we want to talk about and focus on. But, what's probably more risky is actually the, brown discount. So, we're really starting to see, particularly when you get to that sort of sub 4.5 star level, how it's starting to impact yield. We've got some similar stats on net face rents as well. So I think that for all of the discussion around, the best in class green, let's focus more on the risk of inaction. Now, the federal government are obviously bringing out a lot of policy that's, quite onerous for landlords and putting a lot onto them. And they're really coming to the party now to sort of provide or use their power as a tenant to justify the capex and costs required to build sustainable buildings moving forward. So there's a lot of text on this page, but I thought it was important that you have this as a reference. And this is essentially what they have committed to across their real estate portfolio. So where they are looking to be tenants. And you'll see here that they are looking for highly energy efficient offices, industrial warehouses, looking for their employees to only stay at NAB's rated hotels. A focus on electric vehicle charging, a number of things here that they are, really defining the real estate that they will occupy moving forward as tenants. And they're obviously a major tenant across, a number of sectors. So it's really great to see them use their power to help landlords invest in what's required for a net zero future. And I would highlight as well, if you are in a market, Canberra is a great example, or you currently have a government tenant, always make sure you're looking to ensure that your building is going to stay competitive across what they are trying to achieve. The Vic government, as an example, as of 2026, have committed to being, actually, it could be 2025 or 2026, I'll come back to you on that, but have committed to being in only 6-star NABERS rated buildings. Now, that's going to be a tough push because there's not that many 6-star NABERS rated buildings within the city or within the state of Victoria. But again, the government using their power as tenants to really sway and help that investment thesis behind sustainable upgrade. Now, again, this is from that early mover advantage report that I talked to earlier. This assesses the corporates that occupy 5,000 square metre offices or larger in the city of Sydney and Melbourne. And you'll see here that 74% in Sydney and 67% in Melbourne had net zero targets already. And we've, broken that back down from 2025, 2030 and 2050. So there's this massive opportunity for landlords to be able to provide real estate, that is aligning and helping them to meet their net zero targets. And I think we haven't properly seen the real impact that, being able to provide net zero buildings will have from an occupational perspective, but it's a massive opportunity. We look at the likes of Coles and Woolworths as an example as tenants, where they are now being very prescriptive about, having access to on-site solar systems, EV charge points for customer parking. And this is only going to escalate as a lot of these big corporates start to hit their what we call interim net zero targets between 2025 and 2030. So again, this is across all sectors. Industrials are a really interesting one as well, and typically they often are all electric in nature, not always, but often. So, by installing the likes of on-site PV, perhaps some batteries, some electric vehicles, we're really able to access those tenants, particularly those in the sort of last mile logistics space, which are having to, find industrial locations where they will be able to operate their electric vehicle fleets, as majority have committed to in the next 5 years. So, we're really seeing this come through in every major sector of real estate. And so, I guess you've got to reframe the way in which you have looked at CapEx historically, because, the market's changed and tenant demand has changed. And we need to be making sure that decisions we make now are reflective of requirements in the coming years. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I've just included some slides here, given that we will circulate them later, of the number of tenants with lease expiries in the coming year across Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra and Brisbane. So you've got that data around when those big pressure points are of lease expiries, where you can look to offer all electric stock. Now, there's obviously been a lot of conversation here around the big corporates, and that is important. They are very much driven by their own net zero targets and reporting mandates. But as we touched on previously, there's this whole other side of the market, which are going to be the scope 3 to these big corporates. So that's going to change a lot of those smaller businesses and their need to be able to be in all electric stock. But there also is, the point that energy costs are volatile. they're going to be increasingly volatile as the grid decarbonizes and moves away from fossil fuels to renewables. That's unquestionably going to be, a very volatile market moving forward. And so what's a way we can mitigate this? It's to be in highly energy efficient buildings. And where possible that they be all electric. So it's not just big corporates here. Even if you have a portfolio with smaller businesses, there is still absolute upside. And that's really interesting feedback as well we're getting from our metro leasing teams is, it was never a discussion, NABERS ratings in the office market, or we weren't seeing retail providers, retail tenants focus on this historically, but the landscape is changing so quickly, and now these questions are being asked on the regular. Now, what is also interesting that we're starting to see come through is that where even if you don't have an existing building that is, meets that zero carbon definition of being all electric and, highly energy efficient where possible, powered by renewables, there is a great partnership opportunity between landlord and tenant. Let's say you're going through a negotiation and you can say to that tenant, come on the journey. We will commit to delivering this upgrade by your committed date, or even if they don't have a set commitment, just having that discussion. We want to decarbonize this building. We know it's really important for climate change. We're happy to work that into our lease agreement. And use that as a benefit in terms of, at that renegotiation perspective, keeping those tenants and having that de-risk from a capex perspective, that you've got that income guaranteed. And actually what's really interesting is that we've started to see tenants negotiate break clauses, where particularly these are big corporations where they have gone into buildings where there isn't a net zero upgrade plan within their committed time, that their tenant reps have actually negotiated break clauses. And that's being delivered now. I've got 2 on this page. We've just had our TR team negotiate another. So that's an increasing next level or wave of I think, trends that we'll be seeing in terms of how this is impacting real estate. So yeah, get on the front foot. You don't necessarily have to deliver it tomorrow, but really encourage that partnership. I don't know a business in the world that doesn't want to operate in a way that they can have a positive impact on the environment. So leverage that in a way to de-risk the investments required. This is a really great case study within the Melbourne CBD. This is 500 Burke Street, completed by ISPT. And this was it is a 1980s building, previously occupied by another major bank who vacated. And at completion, they were basically left with a building that had all the old fit out, and they were making the decision, do we demolish and build new? Whether they were really going to ever demolish, I'm not sure, but they leant towards the decision here to focus on embodied carbon savings to reposition that building. They were able to, ISPT, recycle, so either donate or recycle all of the old office fit out, so nothing went to landfill. And they have delivered this to 5.5-star NABERS Energy, 6-star Green Star, all electric, and the leasing success of this has been phenomenal. They only PC'd in December. There's about 6,000 square meters left for them to let. So it's about 80%, over 80% occupied. And, even getting tenants like the Department of Climate Change. So we are increasingly seeing, from a tenant perspective as well, this focus on low embodied carbon products. And that's not just from the building perspective, we're also going to see it from a fit out perspective. So another great opportunity for landlords to get on the front foot and use sustainability as a way to market assets and reflect that commitment and resilience of that building, the resilience of that building moving forward. I wanted to also include an example of how an ESG focused value add strategy can really see an outperformance from an investment perspective. So This is a office building in Sydney CBD, sorry, in Pyrmont in Sydney. This asset was purchased by AEW in 2018. AEW, global investor, very focused on net zero and impact investments. They acquired this asset. They didn't spend a huge amount, 2.6 million in capex. So they were very, efficient in the way in which they spent their capital. But we're able to improve the NAB's rating. They installed solar on site. They also focused on that social value and amenity by, putting in fantastic end of trip facilities, really upgraded the lobby space. And within their hold period of, less than 4 years, they were able to create, just shy of 40 million, capital value growth in that time. And, for those on the call just saying, there was a compression of yields in that point, actually we stripped out the performance of the wider Pyrmont market in that period, which was at sort of 7% growth. And this asset outperformed by 21% comparatively and saw a 12% growth, in addition to the general Pyrmont rental growth in that period. Speaking to Kieran at AEW, they've just seen such a great result from this investment that it's paramount to all of their future investments moving forward. So you don't have to, go crazy in terms of the amount that you spend. Having really good advice at the front end is important to make sure that you're seeing that. And Stephen will be running through some of the ways in which they achieve that. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip through this, but essentially what we're seeing here is that regulation is going to change the way in which real estate operates moving forward. Sustainability is definitely not a nice to have. You need to prioritise this to protect asset value and avoid, kind of not doing anything. Inaction is going to lead to potentially, value decreases over the coming years. So stay on the front foot. There are some really great financing opportunities available. NAB releasing this product is a fantastic example of that. And we are seeing absolutely clear benefits from a rental perspective, from smaller void periods between tenants, saleability, the proof is there. So all of the reasons to deliver these works are now absolutely proven by the market. So I'll pass to Stephen now to talk about delivery of net zero.
Thanks, Caitlin. And I'd like to follow on from Michelle's intro and say that my background is in asset repositioning. So I'm all about the implementation of the measures to meet everything that Caitlin's been referring to. Caitlin, are you able to jump to the next slide? Okay, so one of my slides has disappeared, but essentially from the research that Annabelle McFarlane and the JLL research team have been putting together, we've also been tracking the sentiment of owners, investors, and their tenants. And what we've found is that while the big end of town, where Caitlin showed that leases over 5,000 square metres, there's 2/3 of occupants have net zero goals, and they're been implemented between that 2030, 2040 sort of timeline. When you broaden that out to all prospective tenants, you tend to have 3 different cohorts. So you have about 1/3 that are prioritizing sustainability as part of their business as usual. And when they're looking at potential leases, they're looking at a minimum requirement. They're saying 5.5 stars, and not considering any other options. As Caitlin indicated, there was a couple of clients that we've got on the books that it must be net zero. So there's 3 of those transactions now where the asset must be net zero within its term. We find that the second cohort is so the next sort of 1/3 is around clients that prioritize good practice. And these can be clients of any size. So we see clients that are and occupants that are looking at spec suites that might only be 100 square metres, but they are keenly interested in the building's NAB's rating because they see that as synonymous with the building efficiency and quality. So while they might not make their decision purely on the NAB's rating, If they see, say, 4.5 star or greater, it kind of gives them that level of comfort. And then more broadly, we have about a third of clients that are purely just cost focused. So if they are looking at energy efficiency and net zero, they're looking at it from the savings avenue. And that's a legitimate way to go in some of the sort of C and D grade markets. Coming to the slide I have up in front of you at the moment. So we have two options to decarbonise our assets. We have carbon neutral or net zero carbon. And this is coming back to the scope 1, 2, 3 that Caitlin's referring to. We highly prefer to go net zero over carbon neutral. The main issue here being that carbon neutral requires that you emit your carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and then you're relying on someone somewhere else, anywhere in the world, to essentially reabsorb those. So you're using the atmosphere as a giant battery or sink for carbon. That's not a good solution in the long term, and it's hard to calculate and monitor. So generally, principles around carbon reduction are to eliminate carbon at the source. And luckily for buildings, it's very easy to eliminate carbon emissions within the building. So you can replace your scope 1 emissions, so boilers, domestic hot water, with electric alternatives. The other advantage of doing this is that net zero carbon, because you're upgrading your equipment, it's a CapEx cost. So you're investing in your asset, and that's leading to a change in your asset value. Whereas carbon neutral is a OpEx cost. So it's essentially continuing to add to your outgoings. And probably, yep, thanks, Caitlin. So to get to net zero, the pathway is pretty clear. We want a highly energy efficient building. We want it to be all electric, and we want that electricity to be coming from certified renewable sources. The reason why we want to be highly energy efficient is that a lot of gas producing applications have a lot of safety factors built in. So all your hot water systems will be 20 to 40% oversized. And when we move to heat pumps, we no longer need those big safety factors. And given that heat pumps are much more expensive, you want to downsize the capital expenditure there. If we jump to the next slide. So generally, when we're looking at achieving the high efficiency, it is all of the energy improvements that we've come to know and love over the years. So it's focusing on lighting upgrades, controls, and glazing, air conditioning upgrades, etc., all to improve essentially your neighbour's rating. And from a tenant point of view, they're going to be looking at that 5 or 5.5 star to achieve that. In terms of how do we get to an all-electric building, we have alternatives for almost all carbon-emitting applications. So for gas heating, the absolute proven way to go is with electric heat pumps. They come in all shapes and sizes, so there's applications that are suitable for all building types. Gas hot water systems, again, with smaller heat pumps, are absolutely the best way to go. Diesel generators is a more complex one, and there are alternatives around certain biofuels and with synthetic fuels. So opportunities there to degasify your diesel generators. And if you've got very deep pockets, there's opportunities around fuel cells. In terms of cooking, gas cooktops can be replaced with induction, and we've got alternatives for almost every single type of gas cooking. What we see at the moment too is the gas industry is spending a lot of money on promotion at the moment to say gas is better than induction. But from all of our practical experience, it's a like-for-like experience for chefs and retail outlets. In terms of how we achieve renewable energy, Number one recommendation is definitely to put solar cells wherever you can. The payback on these is now to a point where it is very much makes sense in almost all applications. We have the alternative to also take a power purchasing agreement if you want to buy solar from an off-site location like a solar farm or something. And we also have opportunity to buy certified green power, which essentially you can tick a box on your retail energy certificates. And battery storage is also becoming a big opportunity where there's changes in the carbon emissions based on time, so more in the regional areas. Caitlin, yeah, let's jump to the next one. So the approach we take to help out landlords in dealing with all of this is we come in and provide a asset pathway, which is essentially like a very high level assessment of all of the risks and opportunities to decarbonize and improve energy efficiency for an asset, and present that in terms of what is your CapEx spend over the next years. How does that align with the government targets for occupancy or potential tenant targets? And really just give the information for decision making. The way that that information tends to be utilized in a broader context is that if it's a full repositioning of the asset, so normally buildings that are more than half empty and they want to upgrade amenities, lobbies and everything, it's incorporated into a master plan. And if it's a pretty much fully occupied building where it's about improving the neighbours rating and achieving a net zero outcome, we tend to jump straight into implementation, focusing purely on discretionary services upgrades. And I think the most important thing is that it's really hard to maintain a building at 5.5 stars or greater. So we always recommend sophisticated energy management systems and performance tracking. Once you get to 5.5 star, it's as easy as a building controller failing and lights and air conditioning running for a whole weekend to lose your 5.5 star rating. So you really want to be tracking and making sure that nothing is jeopardizing those ratings, particularly if you're starting to write them into leases. I saw someone asked in the chat about costs. So it's a bit of a sliding scale, but we find that the best way to go is a staged approach rather than trying to jump all the way from a 3-star building through to a 5.5 star all electric. Incremental upgrades of services and enhancement through building tuning, optimization, etc. We see that that will gradually lift you up to the 5.5 star level. It's the most optimized approach in terms of capital to get there. And we see that that uplift can cost anywhere between $200 and $600, depending on your building type. So if you have say a 10-story building with all the plant on the roof, it's going to be on the lower end, where the inner city high rises that have like multiple plant levels are going to be on the higher level due to the complexity. Just jump to the next one. So all of this is done to appeal to your occupiers. So it's not going to be done in isolation. There's all kinds of other aspects that might appeal to tenants, and we recommend those are looked at as well from a wellness and a green building point of view. Some of the challenges that we've seen clients face, particularly in CBD areas, is that there are quite a few heritage buildings, and the best place to put a heat pump is on the roof, and that might not get past building approvals or heritage approvals. So there are other alternatives, but it just adds to the cost. Tenant disruption. So there's quite a lot of change going on in the buildings. A lot of this equipment's quite large, needs to be moved up and down throughout the asset. So it's important to stage the upgrades and have clear communications. We've seen in our own building, 101 Collins Street, that this has been done really well, and tenants have been very accepting of the upgrades. And the cost, it's really important to have a strong business case, understand all the grants that are out there from the government. There are hundreds of them, and understand sustainable finance options. So NAB and many of the other large banks have green loan solutions, and that coupled with a net zero pathway enables lower lending costs. And just two quick examples to round out. Rialto is a building that I've been working on since 2013. We gave it a operational performance plan, and that went out to 2022. We stopped managing the building about 2019, but I was really happy to see that our plan was fully implemented, and by 2022 they achieved a 2.5-star reduction, which is a improvement, sorry, that is a 60% reduction in energy. So that's a amazing improvement for a building that was built about 1984. And we have quite a few buildings on St Kilda Road, but one in particular, through some very cost-effective upgrades, we were able to achieve a 1-star upgrade from 3 stars to 4.5 stars, and that puts it in a more competitive bracket with its peers in St Kilda Road, where there's about 25 buildings that are all pretty much identical, competing for the same tenants. And I think I might just stop there so that we can open up time for questions.
Thanks so much, Stephen and Caitlin. If you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Stephen, I might just ask you, you did cover off on the costs. There's a question here about, is the government putting pressure on power companies to increase capacity to ensure the faster delivery so that we can move more quickly towards electric?
I'd say they're going for market-driven alternatives there. There are targets, I've forgotten the exact percentage, but it's around 80% reduction in carbon emissions from the grid. And they're using various market mechanisms through sort of AMO to do that. So the good thing is that the grid itself is working towards becoming greener, and we as building owners and occupiers can do our part too.
Great. While you've got the mic, how can landlords effectively prepare for sustainability upgrades in their buildings?
I think because NABERS ratings are becoming so important and they're starting to impact the valuation and the occupancy of buildings, that making sure that your rating is as optimized as possible. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you have energy sub-metering, that you have good single line diagrams for the building, essentially all of the basic documentation to move forward and have the best NABERS rating.
Okay, thank you. So there's a question here, which is from a tenant perspective. So do we still need a plan if we're renting a commercial space? Do we work with the owner, and where does the responsibility lie?
Yeah, I think it's really important, I think, for all businesses moving forward to have a commitment to sustainability. For all the reasons I touched on, reporting, there is going to be a massive focus on, through the procurement process, which of your suppliers have net zero targets. That will be now a decision-making, focus as to whether you do or don't work with someone. So if you haven't already established an ESG strategy, then that's definitely something you should do. And then from a tenant and building perspective, absolutely work with the landlord from a base build perspective, but certainly within your space, having an understanding of what you can do with your fit out that is going to improve the efficiency of your actual tenanted area is going to be really key. And that's where you're going to see really great operational expense savings as well. So we've got a whole department of the sustainability team that just work with the tenant. So with my cap markets lens, I'm always very landlord focused, but certainly there's a lot that can be done on the tenant side. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Stephen.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. We might jump down to this one, which is when looking to refurbish secondary commercial assets, will credits be available for reusing existing structures? So the carbon embedded in existing building.
Yeah, so there's going to be rebate opportunities from if it was performing at X and you lift it to Y, I think like a lot of them work off a 1-star increase, then you're going to have access to rebates. From a investment perspective, there's obviously opportunity to access green loans. The NAB one, as an example, is specifically linked to energy efficiency improvement. So if you hit that 30% improvement, then you're going to have access to potentially more competitive finance. And the other point I would say is that depending on which way the government move, there is a lot of discussion around changing the Clean Building MIT. Currently, that benefit is prioritised on assets built sort of post-2012, but there is discussion around bringing that timeline back. So it would directly benefit repositioned assets, which quite frankly is what it should be doing, because the greenest building is the one that already exists. So those are the 3 key ways in which we see sort of greater availability. But for the reason I touched on as well, from an income perspective, there's a lot greater interest than we've ever seen. And the Green Star are launching their embodied carbon rating later this year, and that will again just continue to heighten the power of low embodied carbon stock.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And just conscious of time, so we'll just go with one more. There's a question here about the renewable energy measure on the NAB's certification and whether it will recognise the renewable energy component from grid supplied energy.
Yes.
Yep, it already does. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was a quick one, so maybe we've got time for one more.
4 minutes, heaps of time.
Yep.
So there's a question here about, that our webinars obviously covered a lot about new buildings. So in terms of existing buildings, are there mandatory requirements to upgrade, or do you envisage there becoming mandatory requirements to upgrade?
They're mandatory in terms of leasing, is in that you have to have a NAB's rating for office stock to be able to lease or sell a building. So that's already in place. There absolutely will be a time where cities start to create a minimum performance measure. So both the City of Melbourne and the City of Sydney are talking about what's referred to as carbon taxing. So we've seen it out of New York. Essentially, the cities will set a timeline, after which point you are limited to the amount your building can produce from a emissions perspective. And after that point, you will be charged a tax per carbon tonne, which is essentially, a way in which they are saying either invest in the building, upgrade, this is to all of Stephen's points, or we're gonna, there's gonna be a penalty. So I would expect, City of Sydney are hitting their target net zero by 2035, City of Melbourne are 2040. I would imagine it will be, closer to that 2030-ish period that we'll start to at least see commentary around what that looks like. But certainly it's already being delivered in New York, Copenhagen, lots of places in Europe. So that's definitely what's coming next.
I'll probably add to that in that while there are a few mechanisms here that aren't mandatory, there is the very real risk of buildings becoming redundant. We've seen one asset in Sydney where its performance was low, it was very kind of unappealing, and they weren't able to lease space at outgoings plus $1. So essentially that asset has now been repositioned other than office building because it was just no longer relevant in the market.
Thanks, guys. So to everyone on the line, I hope you found today's webinar interesting. I know I've certainly learnt a lot, and I'm going to be looking forward to watching this back just to be able to absorb some more of the fantastic information that's being presented. Thank you so much, Caitlin and Stephen, for your time and really interesting content. For our customers on the line, I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank you for your custom. We do appreciate your business and the relationship that we have with you. I think, we can all see that sustainability is definitely an emerging business challenge, and we're certainly committed to working with our customers to find solutions together. And we really look forward to partnering with you as we all navigate this environment. If you've got any questions or concerns, please contact your banker. Topical at the moment is obviously interest rates. So if you'd like to explore any interest rate strategies, we can also put you in touch with our market specialists. So as we close the webinar, there will be a survey. We would really appreciate it if you take the time to provide us with some feedback, as well as suggestions for any topics for future webinars so that we can make sure we provide you with content that interests you. So have a great day, everyone, and thank you and goodbye.